Hello, everyone. The person who's walking right behind me, it feels a bit like we're at a wedding, actually, doesn't it, Ronni? It is the incomparable Ronni Kahn. Is it there? It's a yellow. It must be you. We both weren't sure whether to leave our coats on or off, but once we warm up, we might start shedding some layers. Now, I can give Ronni a slightly better introduction than that. There's her formal bio, but there's also the intro to the session, which I liked better, which you'll be familiar with, but I think is worth repeating. OzHarvest founder Ronni Kahn has been described as a one-woman freight train for the force for good. From a childhood living under apartheid in South Africa to a socialist commune in Israel, and eventually to the homeless shelters of Sydney, where she started a food waste revolution. This is a story that has to be heard to be believed. So I think we can give Ronni another round of applause.
Thank you so much, and I too would like to acknowledge that we meet here today on the land of the Dark Jung people, and I pay my deep respects to their elders past and present. And my pronoun is she, her.
Thank you, Ronni. And my pronoun is she, her as well. And one of the things that I love about the book and that we share is early on in our careers, we had many people who thought that we were men when we would turn up for various appointments and things. So I love an era of pronouns for many, many, many reasons. Okay, so I know you're all here for a day of programming, but have we got anybody in the audience who has read Ronni's memoir already? And it's okay if you haven't. Okay, because I'm confident by the end of today you'll be taking a copy home to read it, because it is truly extraordinary. I was asking that question of you because that helps us understand how much background we give you on the book and the way that our conversation flows. But also I wanted to see if anybody had a burning question they wanted to ask at the beginning, because I know so often at these kinds of events that we don't get enough time for questions at the end, and often people have been sitting there just busting with that question. All right. So now I'm going to lead us in then, Ronni. So I really want to get to the heart, straight up, of why you wrote this book. And in many ways that's contained in the title of the book, A Repurposed Life. Can you tell us what that means to you?
Absolutely, thank you. I will just share with all of you that my original intention for the book was to perhaps write the 9 ingredients for a delicious life and leave myself out of it, but more what I'd learned along the way. But when Jessie, my co-author and daughter-in-law, and I started writing the book, she said, there's no way, there's too much more that you have to tell and you have to share how you got to be where you are. And I guess the title actually informs the shifts and changes that came upon my life once I found my true calling, or what it is that I was destined to do, which of course has evolved, but really simply was about understanding that there is good food which goes to waste every single day in our society, and making sure that that food went to feed vulnerable people. And so there came a point in my life that my life did become repurposed. And I think that's really why we landed on the title. And I guess the point of the book was to show that every one of us has a story, and every single one of us has a purpose, and every single one of us can focus and redirect in whatever direction they want. And I just happen to be fortunate to have done it through this medium.
And that theme, though, of repurposing comes up throughout the book. And one of the things I want to signal to the audience is, although this is a memoir in many ways, it's so much more, because I know that a big part of the reason that you wanted to share your story, which is a brave thing to do for anyone, is that you knew that there was value in your experiences for other people to access. And I know that that's something that you hear often through your public speaking and through all of the people who seek mentoring and other guidance from you. I just wanted to touch on that Ronni mentioned the ingredients for life, because that's a theme that comes up through the book a lot. And I love this quote from Ronni. "Life throws us mysterious ingredients. If we are brave enough to put the recipe aside and experiment, it's right there that things get interesting." I just love that quote. So most people know you as the CEO and founder of OzHarvest, food rescue charity OzHarvest. But your life has been the sum of many, many parts, and there was a big and rich life before OzHarvest. So when people read the book, what do you think will surprise people the most about your story?
Well, I probably would never have been as honest if I hadn't had Jessie pushing me, because in truth, this is quite naked and raw. And all the way through, I kept saying, no, we're not going to put that bit in. And many of those bits that went in are the bits that have surprised many people. But I think we look at someone and we think that they've accomplished a certain thing in their life or they've reached a certain point. But we don't realize all the stages along the way that have taken them in a very normal, usual life. But there are twists all along. And I think that really it was about sharing some of those things. You know, growing up in apartheid South Africa had a fundamental and profound effect on who I came to be, even though I didn't know that as you were growing up. So each and every one of us has these moments in our lives. Yeah.
So there are about 5 things that I could pick up from there, but I'm going to do my best to come to them. One of the things that is very profound as a reader of the book is you expressing, or you taking us through the experience of you growing up in South Africa, but also returning to South Africa and the different layers of understanding that you came to have about the place that you'd grown up in. And I'm going to come back to that, but I did wonder if that early experience really created the seeds of what you came to do with OzHarvest. Would you say that it did?
Look, there's no doubt, and there's no doubt that my childhood life in South Africa, the experiences within my personal family and what was happening around the country had such an enormous effect. But where I think it's become important to me in my life is now when I either mentor people or in my role as a leader within a business, understanding how role modeling is so important. So the things that I didn't understand are all the things that I subliminally absorbed growing up, both within the country but within my family, and that effect that it has on each and every one of us as we grow.
And there was another quote I wanted to pull out, which was when you returned to South Africa and spent time with one of your early mentors who you didn't even know was a mentor when you were growing up. And this to me is just beautiful, but it also expresses how we grow as people and how we, as I said, we gain... we get access to different layers of understanding. So you're in Soweto, which would have been a place you never would have gone as a child. This terrifying town from my childhood became my clarion call. In one fated romantic instant, Soweto undressed herself for me and showed me her humanity, her flesh as my flesh and her blood as my blood. The electricity of Soweto found its way into my body. It lit a thrilling switch and has never stopped lighting my way. And I think many of us have moments in life that we experience something in one way, and then when we come to it at a different point, we see it in another. But to me, that also speaks to you, and you've often been described as somebody with deep humility, and I think you can only do what you do and be truly in service to others when you find out how you discover your humility. I can see this is moving you, and I find it deeply moving as well. I want to talk about role models, but before we, and I'm really pleased you raised that, because there are so many really inspiring role models along the way in the book. And I'm going to pause for a minute also to say that Ronni is one of my, as I'm sure for many, a huge role model, and one of the great privileges of being a publisher is you get to work with your heroes sometimes. So the question, though, that I want to ask now, which you also touched on, was the fact that you wrote this with Jessica, your daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
So what was that experience like?
Well, given that I love my son dearly and wanted to keep him in my family and her on side, it was an interesting choice. I didn't realize in the beginning. It wasn't obvious to me that I'd write the book with her. In fact, a few other people had approached me to support me and either be ghostwriters and write the book. And I'd almost chosen somebody. And a very close friend, when I was sharing with her, she said, What do you mean? Of course, Jessie should be writing the book. And I said, are you crazy? First of all, she'd never written a book. She's a poet. She's a singer-songwriter. She's exquisite with words, but she'd written our kids' book that I'd commissioned, but she'd never written a biography or written a novel. And the thought of losing her and my son was quite daunting. So we decided, when I was convinced, and my son was the one who said, of course Jessie should write the book with you. She knows you intimately, and you together you will get the story out. And I was petrified to write with her, and we decided we'd do a 3-month trial. And actually, we forgot to check at the end of the 3 months. It just flowed, and we'd go from coffee shop to coffee shop, and the chapters were called Peanut Butter and Jam or Hot Chocolate, because from the different shops where we'd sit and she'd interview me. So it was a wonderful and very enriching and bonding experience. So I had the double whammy of not only trusting her to take my words, play them back to me, and then us together fine-tuning them, but having her wisdom, because she is a poetic soul, and she turned some of those words just into the magic that are in the book, I think.
And she is a really beautiful writer. And we were also a little unsure because she wasn't somebody who had done this before.
Yeah.
But I think what it actually uncovered was a very particular type of alchemy that really touches on the essence of the book, because it's about so many of the themes. We've talked about some of those themes about mentoring. It's about discovering of layers of ourselves. It's about humility. It's about humanity. And there's something that's incredibly powerful about effectively a mother and a daughter doing this together. And she was pregnant at the time as well, so there was...
Yeah, and gave birth the week that the book was due to give birth to itself.
Yeah, so
it was a very extraordinary and timely experience. But I think also what we could never have anticipated was that the book was finished just before COVID, just before the pandemic started. We finished literally, I think, in the end of January, first week in February. And then, of course, we had this whole period that none of us could ever have imagined, and wondering how the book would be received after. And I think the most extraordinary part is that it couldn't have actually been more timely to come out after the pandemic, because through that time people have had the opportunity to look inside, to consider what kind of person they want to be, what kind of work they want to be doing. And the book touches on all of those themes around self-reflection and the ability to direct one's life.
So I want to come from there back to mentors. So there have been some really key people in your life, and one of the things I loved about reading the book was I got to know them in a way independent through your eyes, but also in a way independently of you. So what are some of the lessons that they've taught you, and what stuck from that for you over the years?
Well, one of the very important people in my life is a woman called Selma Brody, who is now, in fact, next week turns 95. She still lives in South Africa, and I spoke to her last week. And really, she was a trailblazer, because she was a very powerful woman who studied medicine when she had 2 children, gave birth to her 3rd child shortly after she qualified, which was ahead of her time and a challenge. And my mother landed up looking after her kids. So from her, I have just always learned, again, subliminally, because they were our neighbors. We had 3 girls. My mother had 3 girls, and they had 3 boys. And we just were, they cut a hole in their fence so that we could just share houses. They had a swimming pool, we didn't. And she just always was the epitome of a confident, and in fact she's not a confident woman. This is the interesting part about her. She's quite insecure for all her successes. But probably that mix was also what was so attractive and so engaging. But she was just such an accomplished woman, and it was a role model. My mother worked always, was the beautiful wife to my father. He came first, our family came first, but Selma's career and life were just bigger and bolder than anyone I knew. And she showed me what a woman could be, actually.
Well, I actually have another quote here, that she was someone who could merge her career, and a passionate one at that, with moral commitment. So that was a big lesson. But I'm so interested too that you mention her insecurity, because I think that often, well, everybody, but women particularly, there's such a polemic in that if you're a successful woman, then that means that you're impervious to all of the other aspects of being human. And I think often when you are very successful, then you can feel quite exposed. Of course, you could feel insecure. But I'm so fascinated at that duality in her, that you see that as something that makes her even more interesting and more inspiring.
Absolutely, because she overcomes that. And it's an interesting thing, because I think there's a phrase in the book that, you know, I would rather be a mouse in the corner. And, you know, people look at me and say, okay, she wears all these bright colors and she's out there. And quite honestly, you know, I was asked this week, do you think you're an, you know, I wasn't asked, I was told that I'm an extrovert. I think I'm an introvert. So it's just always so interesting how one sees oneself and yet other people see you.
Yes. Okay, so speaking of people, you just talked about your mother, who I found, and I know you did, an incredibly inspirational figure, because you just mentioned that she supported your father, yet when your father was in a terrible accident, your mother just, from a standing start, just got out there and did everything that it took to look after you all. So incredible grit, and I mean, I see you as a bit of a combination of the two of them. How do you, or what impact do you think your mother had?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that I always used to think that all my energy came from my mother, because my mother was this bright, as I say, my dad had this near fatal accident. They didn't know that he'd live the night. And my mother, from not being a working woman, suddenly had to support the family and 3 children, because it turned out that my dad was in hospital for the next 2 years. And she just, none of my 2 sisters or our friends would ever see my mother not smiling, not positive, not getting out there and doing whatever she had to do with this extraordinary strength and ability to just take whatever comes and run with it. And there's no doubt that from that point of view, not only did I find that incredibly admirable, that she has been a model for me on a way of living, which is, we never know what's round the next corner. And all you can do is just to be the very best you can be each and every day.
There's another mentor we'll come to in a little while, but you touched on the fact that when you were growing up, you would have seen yourself as not the pretty one, not the extrovert, yet, as you say, many people would see you as the opposite now. So people know you as the CEO of OzHarvest. They know you as the person who has driven change, who is advocating, who is a spokesperson for all of these issues, who is driving change in the political landscape, who is doing so many things. Did you see, when you were that girl growing up, could you see even a kernel of that future woman?
I'm going to be honest, and the answer is no. I honestly, I didn't see that. It seems others did, but I didn't.
Yeah, because you were asked to consider being captain of the school, weren't you?
Yep. And there was no way I was going to get up on a stage and speak in front of anybody. And yet now, just put me on the stage and I will talk.
Isn't that incredible? And I think it's so, this kind of goes to the point that we were making before about the insecurities that people can have. And I think that speaks more to something that I know is very, very important to you, this idea that we are our whole selves. It's something that's important to me as well. I think, you know, in our working lives, in our daily lives, we are the sum of so many parts of ourselves. Can you elaborate on that idea a little more?
I sure can, because I think, you know, if any one of you has had anything to do with OzHarvest, one of the things about this organization that I run is there is an energy and culture within it that is actually quite contagious. And if I could pickle that and put it in a bottle and sell it, we'd make a fortune and I wouldn't have to fundraise for OzHarvest. But it is this notion for me that every single person must be able to bring their whole selves to work and must be able to be who they are meant to be. But even if I want to touch back on this notion of now that I can sit on a stage and talk. I think it's because, obviously, when one finds what it is that one is either passionate about or driven to do, it becomes so much easier to talk about the things that you love and the things that make a difference. And I think that, you know, that ties back into being able to bring one's whole self and be who you are meant to be at any given moment in one's life.
And not feel uncomfortable or insecure in that as well, because there's nothing to be uncomfortable about. There's nothing to be hiding. It's incredibly liberating, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want some water?
Yes.
And I'm going to shed my coat. Okay, we just have to put these down for a second. Okay, that was a lot harder to do than I thought it was going to be. Okay, so we're getting a bit of a theme of the sum of parts. I'll talk so you can do the water, and I can hold a mic. Yeah, so we're having a bit of there's a bit of a theme emerging about the sum of parts. And it's not just the sum of who we are, but I think it's also the sum of our lives, our life experience. It's also very easy when people are well known to imagine that they've had some kind of charmed life. Now you've dealt with your fair share of tough moments. What strikes me is you, like your mother, have that resilience, that optimism. And what is really startling through the book is that some of those really tough moments are the moments that led you into into some of the most interesting chapters of your life. We open the book. You're 51. It's a really low point in your life, but it turns out that it's a major shift for you. Yep. And I think for many people, the idea that life, it's not that life begins at 50 or 51, but a new life starts to emerge, or a new chapter of life. At that moment, again, did you imagine when you were going through that, and that's a very raw thing that you share with us, and I think that's one of the really powerful moments of the book. You had, I asked before, when you were that girl, did you have that kernel? I get the sense that as that 51-year-old woman, you had a kernel of a sense that there was going to be more. Can you talk us through, not the detail of what led to that moment, but the shifting point of your life there?
So I think what I can only share what happened for me was, we're talking about a relationship that I went into that turned out to be a major turning point in my life. And there's no doubt that coming out of that led me to a greater understanding of who I was and who I didn't want to be. I think that was the most important part of the shift that happened in me. I recognized the parts in me that I really didn't like and chose to leave those behind, I guess, and really try and discover who I was and how I could make a difference. So it is interesting that moment gave me the power. It had taken away all my power, but leaving that and recognizing that in fact I could actually shift and be the person that I was meant to be. And it's so interesting because so many women have written to me after reading the book and saying, that happened to me, or I experienced that. So it seems that it's quite a common thing. It's just what we do with the knowledge we have when we discover that we know who we want to be or would like to be.
Yeah, the reason I think it's powerful is it's not just that you're sharing a difficult time in your life, but you're sharing the fact that, I mean, lots of people experience that, as you say, and I mean, basically a shitty partner that was, in hindsight, you look and you go, how could I have done that? I've done that. I'm sure lots of people in the audience have done that. And it's easy to feel a sense of shame about that, but it's not. There's nothing to feel shame for. It's
I will share with you all that if any chapter I didn't want in the book, of course it was that one. And after we'd written it, I said, okay, Jessie, now we've written it, and of course that's not going to be in the book. And she said, what do you mean? It's like the most powerful thing. And I said, no way. Anyway, she convinced me. Clearly, it's in the book.
Well, and it was one of the first chapters that we read, and what was also powerful was it was just a deconstructing of myth, and we all have our version of the own myths about ourselves that we can carry through life, and I think this all comes back to that whole notion of being our whole selves, warts and all, and I believe that the reason that you're so powerful in sharing or in inspiring others is that honesty and that's how we all move forward in life, is when we actually don't just share the good stuff, but we share the fact that we can all make mistakes. I also found, and I think not just women, but I think many women would identify with that idea of you're at a stage of life and you suddenly feel like maybe you're not in the place that you're meant to be. And this was before this relationship. This was when you left your marriage. Yeah. And you say, I didn't even quite know. It was as though I was being powered by a force outside myself. I left. But in hindsight, I was really, the work that you needed to do or the things that you needed to discover were in you. They weren't necessarily an issue with your husband or your marriage. I think that's a really interesting thing that lots of people would identify with. Is there anything else about that experience that you would reflect on now? Not the nitty-gritty of a breakdown of a marriage, but because there were those signs, weren't there, that you needed to be doing something else? Yeah,
and it takes courage to actually do that. I mean, in terms of that particular marriage, he's a wonderful man. You know, I could have stayed with him. And again, both men and women who've read the book have come to me about many of those instances that I share in the book. But I definitely think that sometimes timing is everything in life, and timing of a relationship is everything in life, and recognizing when and how one needs to move through things. And so that's really, I guess, knowing when it's time to move or when it's time to stay, having regrets and not having regrets, but moving on and living with that knowledge.
Yeah, and there's a lesson in there too about really we have to take ownership for our own actions and for our own happiness, fulfillment, purpose. It's very easy to put that responsibility on the other people in our lives, isn't it?
Absolutely. That is the most fundamental thing each and every one of us has got, and that is look after yourselves, no blame, no blaming somebody else. Take responsibility for our own actions.
So all of this is before OzHarvest even began. So I think we should talk about OzHarvest a little bit now. So tell us about, you had a successful events business. And tell us a little more about that sort of light bulb moment when you realised that there might be a different way of looking at what you were doing at that point in time.
So in the event industry, and I'm sure each and every one of you have catered for something or held an event, a party, cooked for a Christmas dinner and had masses of leftovers. So in my event business, I was doing that all the time. I'm ethnic. I didn't want anyone to leave my events and have to go to Macca's on the way home. The tables groaned, and so for years in my event business, at the end of an event, because most of them were in unique spaces that weren't so easy at the end of it to think about it, but we didn't think about it. The caterers would just throw away that food. But I did an event. I did one event that was like a Roman banquet, just stalls and masses of food, masses and masses of food, because it was for 1,000 people. And food is about dignity, food is about sharing and caring and respect and success. You know, one of the ways I'd show that my clients were very successful was through abundant generosity of giving food. And I did this event, and there were also barrels of wine and kegs of beer, and the guests walked in, went straight to the bar, and within half an hour were pissed, and they didn't touch the food. And suddenly there was just an unconscionable amount of food that I knew I just thought, what could I do with it? And so I loaded it up into my vehicle and took it to the one charity that I knew existed, because that was not my world. And sort of that was the beginning of my rogue food rescuing life. So I'd started doing that until I realized that actually if I had this problem, maybe other people had the same problem. And did some research and realized nobody else was doing anything with leftover food. So I don't even know why I was the gifted one to decide that it was therefore up to me.
But it started with the issue of waste.
Yeah.
And became an issue then of supporting other people and of dignity and connection.
Yeah.
So can you talk us through
Yeah.
that, and also then a bit about those early years?
Yeah, so I guess what I didn't know then, when I was collecting the surplus food, I just really thought it's just ridiculous that this beautiful food doesn't feed hungry people. I didn't really understand how many hungry people there were, and I didn't know how much food was going to waste. I also didn't know that food waste actually feeds climate change. So there were three things I didn't know, and three things that became very apparent very quickly, that in Australia, well, today we have 6 million people who need food relief at any time of the year. But even then, it was 3-4 million people. I didn't know that. I didn't know how much food goes to waste. I thought, I'll just do this for a bit until I solve the problem. 175 million meals later, it wasn't such a bad idea. But what I didn't know was that a third of all food goes to waste globally. That's a third of food in Australia. A third. Wait, now mine's doing something funny. I think you can hear me without it anyway. So I didn't know that a third of all food goes to waste. So what started off as making sure that the food that I saw fed hungry people has now become the desire to create a solution and not just a Band-Aid. I wasn't just trying to feed hungry people. Now I know that a third of all food goes to waste, and that food waste affects climate change. It didn't take long before we realized that not only had I created a social organization, I'd also created an environmental one. And I think that's really what has been so profoundly important in its success, in that we're tackling two big problems and we do it very transparently. And I think out of naivety I started. If I'd have known now what I knew then, maybe I'd have been daunted, but it just didn't occur to me that I was going to be tackling such a big problem, or that it would take over my life. And at the time I just thought, I'll just do this so that, and then it became the whole changing of lives and trying to make the biggest difference one could make.
And you've probably just been through one of the most difficult years of all with the organisation. So what do we need to know about the impact of COVID on the work that you do?
Yeah. Well, the first thing we need to know about the impact of COVID on each and every one of us is not to forget it and not to think we should just move on and go back to what we were, because we will never be the same again, and nor will our world ever be the same again. But what happened to us was that in those first weeks when there was panic buying, there was no food available from supermarkets. So for the last 16 years, we had rescued food from everywhere in the food supply chain. That's what we do. But suddenly, charities were closing because there was no volunteers, because a lot of volunteers are elderly and needed to look after themselves. There was scarcity of food, and there was more need than ever before because people started losing their jobs. So 1 million more people in Australia have fallen through the cracks through COVID. And I don't care what our government tells us, and I don't care what the economics look like. I can tell you that we will need food rescue and food relief for a very long time moving forward. So we had to resort to purchasing food for the very first time. And I also had to lobby government because up until COVID, 3% of our budget came from government. I never wanted to rely on government because it's so fickle. Governments change and policies change, and it's just never been reliable. So we've always relied on philanthropic funding, individuals, corporates, foundations. But through COVID, for the first time, we really had to lobby. And our funding went from government from 4% to 30%, which ends on the 30th of June. So I am lobbying again because we rolled out so many new programs that are absolutely necessary. And I've just been writing letters to many of our agencies saying, due to lack of funding, we will have to end some of those programs. But there've been some interesting responses. So the story's not over yet.
Yeah, and people often don't understand some of the really practical things that you have to. Now it's going to be my mic, but I think everybody's more interested in hearing from you than me. So best for you to have the best mic. There are some really practical things that you have to do in the charity, and one of them is, I mean, not only lobbying, but actually going out and, you know, one of the really powerful things you did was change legislation about food waste at the very beginning. Yep. Some of these dumb things that get in the way. To maybe speak about that for a moment.
Oh, well, I think it's more that there are often obstacles in all of our lives. Certainly when I started OzHarvest, so many people were so generous and loved, and businesses just said, of course we're going to give you food. And then I started coming across a few that said, oh, we won't give you food because we're worried about our liability. And so it seems that I prefer people not to say no to me. I definitely prefer people to say yes. And the ones that say no, I say mind out the way. But we did have to lobby government to get laws changed to allow us to get more food, to feed more people, and to make it possible for any food business to give away their food without liability. And we did that in 4 states, and the rest followed.
So that was one of your freight train moments.
Well, I run a transport and logistics business. I just run it for free.
I love that. I want to just go to a quote from Jimmy Barnes here, and sorry, I'll just hold it out there. No, swap. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
It doesn't matter. Okay, I just wanted to share this quote from Jimmy Barnes because I think it really humanises what OzHarvest does as well. You don't get used to living permanently behind the 8 ball. No matter how long you've done it, it doesn't get easier. There's a constant sense of shame that eats away at you, making you feel you're just not good enough. Some people are so poor they can't even afford to feel shame. Ronni Kahn, through her work with OzHarvest, does the very thing that offers hope to those in the poverty trap: restore dignity and remove shame. And I think that's not only a powerful quote, it's a really important thing to remember. And when you were talking about COVID, it's easy. In some ways, COVID made a whole lot of problems in the world less visible. I think, you know, many of us, if we were privileged enough to be able to bunker down and stay in our own bubbles, and many people had all sorts of problems around that, that it was easy to almost to feel like the world had become a better place. You didn't see as many homeless people because we actually weren't out of our houses. You didn't see those problems, they weren't so overt. So I think what you said before about we really need to remember that the world will never be the same again, and those problems that were there before have just been amplified. Tell us about the order of the teaspoon.
Okay. It's a very precious quote that I came upon, and it's the afterword of the book. But maybe I'll just share the quote with you, because I think that's really the best way to tell the story. So it's a quote by an Israeli author called Amos Oz, who quite recently passed away. And he was the moral compass of Israel, a wonderful communicator, and really believed in the democracy of the Middle East, and Israel in particular. And I came across this quote, and I think it's quite precious. And so precious that I put it in the book. And it goes like this. In the event of a huge conflagration, like a fire, we as humans all have three principal options as to how we could behave. Number one, we can look at that fire and run away as fast as we can and leave those that cannot run to burn. Number two, we can write an angry letter to the newspaper demanding that those who started the fire be punished. Or number three, we can run and find a bucket. And if we cannot find a bucket, we find a jug. And if we cannot find a jug, we can run and find a teaspoon. Because we all have a teaspoon. Now I know that a teaspoon is tiny and the fire is huge, but there are millions of us. And if we all use our teaspoon, we can make a difference. And so goes the quote. I would like to create the order of the teaspoon, where we all walk around with a teaspoon on our lapel, or around our necks, I wear a teaspoon, or on my finger, I wear a teaspoon to remind us of the good deeds that we can all do each and every day. So I would like all of you to do something, please. Can you all please do this? Look into your hand, because there in your hand is your metaphorical teaspoon. Can you take that teaspoon? Can you put it in your heart? And can you use your teaspoon every single day? I'm sure you all do already, but it's to remind you. Except I do have one teaspoon here. Is there anyone who is brave and courageous enough who would like to take a teaspoon? It's pre-loved. In fact, everything is pre-loved around me. Pre-loved and pre-purposed. This one is from, where is it from? Canberra? What does it say? I can't read it.
Canberra War Memorial. Canberra War Memorial.
You'd like that teaspoon? Well, it does come with a hug. You up for a hug? Use it well.
So Hilton Harmer strikes me as being
an angel.
And he is the very definition of the teaspoon in action. He's a Salvation Army volunteer for over 50 years. When I read about him, that was another moment I really cried in the book. Tell everybody a little about Hilton, because he is another one of your mentors. Yeah.
So if you ever have heard the word Christian, like a true Christian, not in the religious term, but in that notion of, I guess, behaving, and obviously this is religious, but like Christ would. This is a man who has taken off his shoes physically to give to somebody else. He's an extraordinary human being who wakes up in the morning just saying, God, what good can I do today? And he's just beautiful. He's 83. He's not well at the moment. So I just want to say a little prayer and wish him well. But he just wakes up every day and all he can do is do good, and his good has spread in just for his 80th birthday. So he delivers food, he takes food from us and delivers it to asylum seekers, to refugees, to people who couldn't get to agencies. And so he'll come to us at any time, and sometimes we've got a bakery that bakes cakes. And then Hilton will take the cake to another bakery if he knows, he's always knows someone whose birthday is that day who would never have a cake. And he's got a bakery that will add the person's name on the cake so he can take them a birthday cake. So on his 80th birthday, we called him to say we had a cake he had to collect. I mean, we'd arranged this before. We had a cake he had to collect to take to somebody. And all he was so excited about was that he could come and collect the cake. But in fact, what we'd done is we'd invited all the people he'd helped. And we had prepared a surprise. I could cry thinking about it. We prepared a surprise 80th birthday party for him. And he came in on his birthday when he was on his way to a lunch that his wife was taking him to collect the cake that he could drop off somewhere, and walked into our warehouse. And there were all this, it was like a cultural revolution, because there was every ethnicity there, because he just helps anybody and everyone. And it was just the most beautiful moment. So he is just a living role model who, even when he's ill, just all he can think about is what good he can do to other people. Yeah, a true saint.
True saint, yeah, and there are many moments in the book that you get a sense of, I'm not religious either, but true Christianity in action, and that's one of the things that OzHarvest has also done. You talked about if you can just bottle the essence of what's being created there.
Well, I think I'm a magnet for magnificent people. I'm surrounded by them.
Well, we're almost getting to the point of asking questions, so that's a nice segue into, I wanted to ask you, you've worked with governments, CEOs of major corporations, chefs, all of these people who have not said no. You've been recognised for your work, you've been awarded an Officer of the Order of Australia, Boss Magazine's Top 21 True Leaders, an Australian Local Hero Award. After all these extraordinary achievements, what gives you the most satisfaction?
Waking up every day. Sorry.
It's okay.
Knowing that what I have the ability to do is to make a difference to somebody else.
No apology necessary. I talked about humility and humanity and whole selves, and that's what you are, and that's what this experience is like for all of us. We started by saying that your book is an inspirational memoir. On some levels, I said it is much more than that. It is actually the order of the teaspoon writ large. What do you hope people will do after reading A Repurposed Life?
Just look in the mirror and know how powerful they are, and that they can just do whatever it is they choose to do or be.
Thank you, Ronni. Actually, I'm just going to do a little ovation for Ronni. I reckon that's a moment. Can people join me in standing just to... Sorry. have some questions in the audience? Yes. Is somebody taking a mic around? Yes. We've got the lady in the beautiful pink jumper.
Hello. Ronni, as a former South African journalist for many years in apartheid South Africa, I think what you've done is magnificent. But I wondered why, with Dr. Selma Brody as an example, as a mentor, you didn't start something in South Africa. It took you a very long circuitous route via Israel and then Australia, where the differences with poverty are not nearly as stark as in South Africa, to begin this charity. Why didn't you start earlier in a country with much sort of greater disparity of wealth and poverty?
So I left South Africa at 17. Mandela, it seemed, would never be released. And I wasn't brave and courageous enough to stay in South Africa and fight. However, one of my most burning desires was that OzHarvest would start in South Africa, and South Africa Harvest is 2 years old, and it's just delivered its 5 millionth meal, and they're doing extraordinary work there. And it's our model that I've given to Selma's son, Alan, who is the CEO of South Africa Harvest.
That to me is one of those examples of you see different parts of your life or different moments in reflection with clarity that you don't see at that moment in time. And you talk about growing up and your parents not being particularly political, even though they were very, very good people, but you were living in systemic racism. Yeah? Have we got any more questions? This gentleman at the front.
It says here, it mentions that you ended up in a socialist commune in Israel. Now that word is sort of a non-word in Australia, as we know.
Which one, commune or socialist?
The socialist. Many of us from, say, the 60s know what a commune is. But I'm just wondering how the fact that it was a socialist commune might have informed you and your life as it went forward.
Thank you. So I lived on a kibbutz, which is a socialist commune, a socialist community based on ideals where everybody works according to their ability and gets according to their need. And there's no doubt that it fundamentally changed my life, because I had gone from South Africa, where people were discriminated against because of the color of their skin, to an environment where everybody was treated equally. And although I didn't stay there, I lived there for 10 years and found it fascinating. I discovered that an independent soul didn't do so well in that environment. The core basis of equality are the values that came back to me when I chose to start and living within a value-led, purpose-led life.
We have a question up the back there.
Thank you, Ronni, for your repurposed life. It's been incredibly inspiring, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. One question I have for you is, you obviously find it difficult accepting no as a response to your many requests. How do you manage your life when you would obviously at times have to say no to others, or do you never say no?
There would be those who'd say, I never say no. Look, I see challenges, not obstacles. I do try my best to understand when things can't work out the way I'd like them to. This isn't so much about me, it's about, obviously in one's own life. There are times when you can't do what you want to do, but everything, I'm driven, the only thing that drives me is the impact we can make and how we do that in the most effective way. So no sometimes turn out to be ways that you just have to find a different way of getting to the solution. But I'm probably not very good at being told no personally as well. I could check in with the people who live with me, but I'd prefer not to.
I think we probably have room for one more question. Oh, we've got two people with hands up, so let's take those two questions.
Thanks very much, Ronni. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge that COVID brought OzHarvest to the coast, the Central Coast, and it continues to provide really needed services across the coast, so thank you, and it's much appreciated amongst the community service agencies on the coast. Second, my question is, did the actual writing of the book give you new insights into your life that you hadn't actually realised before?
Without doubt. There is no way that, writing the book brought a whole new level of who I am, who I was, who I want to be. For sure. It's a fascinating process, very confronting and challenging, but fascinating. Yeah, because you have to face a lot of demons along the way.
And when you read the audio book, that really stitched everything together.
Well, I had never really read the book until I read the audio book, because we were just doing all these chapters and then suddenly it was put together and then suddenly it was done. And then I got to read the audio book, and you have to do that I did it over 5 days, 2.5 hours at a time. And it was really the first time I'd read the book from cover to cover. And I was a little bit impressed that we'd written the whole book and that it was chronologically, that it kind of worked.
More than kind of. I think we've got one final question over this side.
Can you tell us anything further about what OzHarvest is doing on the Central Coast, just to bring it close to home for us all?
Sure. Well, what happened was we started with a hub because we knew that there was a challenge and we knew that there were pockets that needed support, and we thought we only had funding for a couple of months, but we've made that work and it's going to continue. So the truth is, I get confused because I'm not even 100% sure. I know it started in one place. Can you share exactly where it is? Because I get so confused with all our chapters and my geography is pretty shit.
I can do that. Initially it was operating out of building a theatre, actually, that couldn't open because of COVID, Red Tree Theatre up at Tuggerah, and which was a new facility, and that became available to OzHarvest through personal connections that happened.
Yeah.
And so once COVID restrictions changed, and the theatre could then open, they had to move because the theatre was actually turned into a whole production line, and there were volunteers packing in cooperation. It was with, I think, the Lions Club. There were a lot of volunteers that did a lot of work, and the truck was there and would go and deliver through community centres all over the coast, and initially, as you said, you had to buy food, and then the processes were set up to get the donations from all sorts of fruit and vegetable places, from supermarkets and everything around the coast. So it became a sustainable food.
Yeah,
salvage
and it's
operation.
supported by Newcastle as well.
Yeah.
So we're in Newcastle.
Yeah.
We've been in Newcastle for 10 years.
And it
Yeah.
subsequently has found a new home at a building that's associated with one of the Christian schools up behind Wyong, in the hinterland behind Wyong. And so that's the base where all the food packing and everything goes. And then the truck goes out and delivers through community centres, who then have food hubs that people come once a week or whatever to collect their food that they need. So that's, as I understand it at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's our model. I'm sorry, I just didn't know the exact details of where. I knew when it was in Tuggerah and I knew it had moved, but I'd kind of forgotten where it had moved to, because we've got
So many chapters.
volunteer, beautiful chapters all over, and I get muddled.
All right, I have read this book 3 times now. I said at the beginning that one of the great things about being a publisher is you get to work with people who are your heroes, but also at Murdoch Books we publish books for living life well, books that can make a difference in the world. Ronni will be signing this afterwards. $1 of every copy we donate to Murdoch Books will donate to OzHarvest, and Ronni is also donating some of the proceeds, her proceeds from the book. I'd like to finish with a little story of another moment of Ronni not taking no for an answer in the nicest possible way, because she pushes everybody else to do better all the time. This book is also pioneering. It is the first time, I think, that a book has been published with not only the internal pages, but a cover that is fully recyclable, because most books' covers have actually got plastic in them. And Ronni told us that it could be done. There are lots of reasons that make it tricky, but you know what? It could be done. So I hope you treasure your copy for that reason as well. Thank you very much, Ronni. What a privilege it's been for all of us to spend this time with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.